Look at my ex-husband, 19 years and still swinging a hammer, still alone, and now an imaginary wife? Did you invent one just to walk in here with something? 3 years now. 3 years. Then where is this mystery wife? Or does she only live in your head? She is on her way. Sure she is. Inventing a whole marriage. That is almost sad. You might want to slow down. You are about to say something you cannot take back. I am in construction. We closed a contract with the state on Thursday. She had no idea. 2 days before that reunion, the man she was laughing at had signed the final page of a $387 million infrastructure contract with the state of Missouri. His name was on it, not a company name. His. And every single person laughing in that room was standing underneath a roof he had paid $840,000 to rebuild 2 years earlier, on the one condition that nobody would ever be told. There is a particular kind of quiet that people mistake for defeat. It looks the same from the outside. A man stops explaining himself. He stops correcting the record. He stops showing up to the places where the record gets written. And everyone who knew him decides, without ever saying it out loud, that he must have lost. Emmett Cobb had lived inside that quiet for 19 years, and on a Saturday night in October, in the auditorium of the high school he had graduated from, a woman he had once been married to stood in front of 40 of their former classmates and said, loud enough to carry, that he had never amounted to anything. She was wrong in a way that was about to become extremely public. But to understand how wrong, and why it mattered so much more than money, you have to go back and understand what Emmett Cobb actually built, and what it had cost him, and who had been keeping the receipt. Emmett Cobb was 44 years old October, and he owned a heavy civil construction company called Cobb Bridge and Structure, headquartered in a converted machine shop on the east side of Kansas City, Missouri. Heavy civil is the unglamorous end of construction. It is not houses, and it is not skyscrapers. It is bridges, retaining walls, river crossings, the concrete and steel that everybody drives across every day of their lives without once thinking about it. It is work that only becomes visible when it fails. He had come to it the long way, and the long way started with a man named Willis Cobb. Willis Cobb was Emmett's grandfather, and he had been a carpenter in Kansas City for 41 years. He framed houses, hung doors, built stairs, and set roof trusses in a city where, for most of his working life, he was not allowed into the union that would have made that work pay what it was worth. That is not a detail invented for sympathy. It is documented history. The building trades in most American cities ran closed apprenticeship systems well into the 1960s, and in some locals into the 70s, and black carpenters and electricians and pipe fitters worked outside them. Same hours, same buildings, non-union scale, no pension at the end of it. A man could spend 4 decades helping make a city and retire owning nothing but his tools. Willis Cobb retired with his tools. They were framing tools, hand tools, the good pre-war steel. A 20-ounce framing hammer, 4 chisels, a block plane, a folding rule. Sometime around 1955, he heated a nail and burned his initials into every wooden handle. WC. He did it because tools walked off job sites. He also did it because a man who has been told his labor does not count learns to put his name on the things that are his. He died when Emmett was 15. He left the tools to the boy. Emmett learned the trade with those tools in his hands, first in the woodshop at Fairlane High School in the Bright Bank neighborhood. Then on crews, then on bigger crews. And eventually at 31, he put his own name on a company with 2 trucks, a used excavator, and a line of credit that made him sick to look at. By that October, Cobb Bridge and Structure employed 240 people. They had rebuilt 11 bridges across 3 states. And 2 days before the reunion, Emmett Cobb's signature had gone on to the final page of a $387 million contract with the State Department of Transportation for the rehabilitation of a river crossing that carried 60,000 vehicles a day. The 19 years between those 2 facts were not a montage. That is the part people get wrong when they hear a story like this. They imagine a rise. What actually happened was that Emmett Cobb worked, and for a long stretch in the middle he was not rising at all. He was holding position, which in that business is harder. There were 4 years where the company was 3 trucks and 11 men, and a backlog he could hold in his head. There was a January where he made payroll by not paying himself for 9 weeks and told nobody. There was a bid in his 6th year that he lost by $11,000 on a project he had spent 4 months preparing. And he sat in the parking lot of the state office building afterward for 40 minutes before he could make himself drive. He built the thing the way he had been taught to build everything, which was one correct joint at a time. In a part of the industry where almost nobody outside of it will ever know your name. That is worth understanding, because it explains something about the man that the rest of this story depends on. Bridges are inspected. Every bridge in the country carrying public traffic gets walked, measured, and rated on a schedule. And the ratings run from 0 to 9, and the number everybody in the trade watches for is 4. 4 means the structure has entered what the manuals call poor condition. And once a bridge goes to 4, it starts collecting load restrictions and closures, and the specific kind of political attention that arrives too late to be useful. Emmett Cobb had built his entire company around the 4s. Other contractors chased new builds, because a new build is clean and photographs well and gets a ribbon cutting. Emmett took rehabilitation work, which means going out to a 70-year-old structure in February and finding out what is actually wrong with it, which is never what the file says. He had a saying about it that his project managers repeated to each other, usually with affection and occasionally with exhaustion. The drawings tell you what somebody intended. The steel tells you what happened. It is a very good way to run a construction company. It is, as things turned out, an even better way to look at a marriage, though it took him about a decade longer to make that connection that it should have. His grandmother, Emmett Cobb, raised him after his mother went to Denver and did not come back. She lived on a narrow street, Brightbank, in a house with a porch that faced west, and she sat on that porch most evenings from April to October with a glass of sweet tea she never finished. She told him something once that he never managed to shake loose. "Baby," she said, "the people who talk loudest about what you failed at are usually the ones most afraid you are about to prove them wrong." She was right about a lot of things. She was particularly right about that. The reunion was the 25th for the Fairlane High School class that Emmett Cobb had graduated with. And it was being held for the first time in the school's history, in the school's own auditorium, rather than a rented hall. There was a reason for that. And the reason is the first thing you need to hold on to, because it is going to matter a great deal in about 40 minutes of story time. Fairlane High School's auditorium had been condemned 4 years earlier. Not dramatically. Nobody was hurt. An engineer doing a routine facilities assessment found that the roof trusses over the seating area had been repaired sometime in the 1970s with the wrong grade of steel, and that the repair had been quietly failing ever since, and that the district needed either $840,000 or a chain across the doors. The district chose the chain. Now, there is a thing that happens with school buildings in neighborhoods like Brightbank that is worth naming plainly, because it is not a conspiracy and it is not an accident. It is arithmetic. School facility money in most states is tied in significant part to local property tax bases. A neighborhood with lower property values generates less facility money. The buildings in those neighborhoods are usually older, which means they need more. Less money, more need, year after year, compounding for 60 years. You do not need anyone to be a villain for a school auditorium to sit dark for 4 years. You only need a formula. So the auditorium sat dark, and Fairlane held its assemblies in the gym, where nobody could hear anything, and the class of 2000 held its 20th reunion at a VFW hall next to a slot machine. Then, 2 years before the reunion, an anonymous donor funded the entire rehabilitation. New trusses, new seating, new acoustic panels along the sidewalls. The district wanted to put a name on a plaque by the entrance, and was told through an attorney that there would be no plaque, no ceremony, and no announcement. And that if any of those 3 things happened, the remaining disbursement would stop. There was no plaque. The auditorium reopened. And on the third Saturday in October, 43 members of the Fairlane Cream class of 2000 were drinking cheap wine from plastic cups. Underneath $840,000 of steel that one of them had paid for, and none of them knew about. Emmett Cobb had not planned to come. Rhonda Sayers was the one who talked him into it. Rhonda had sat behind him in 10th grade biology and had never once in the 27 years since spoken to him in a voice that could be described as gentle. She called him on a Thursday while he was in his truck on the interstate with a cup of gas station, coffee going cold in the holder. "You are going," Rhonda said. "I have a job in Sedalia Monday. Sedalia will still be there." She let a beat pass. "Emmett, you have spent 19 years building your life back up where nobody could see you do it." That is fine. That was the right call at the time. But there is a difference between privacy and hiding, and I think you crossed that line about a decade ago and never noticed. I am not hiding. Then come, not to prove anything, just to close the door properly. Doors that stay cracked open for 19 years let a lot of weather in. He sat in his truck for a while after she hung up. The truth was that he had built a good life, and it was a quiet one, and he liked it that way. He had a wife who had never once asked him to be louder than he was. He had work that mattered, and men who had been with him 12 years. He did not need a room full of people from Fairlane High School to confirm any of it. But there was a small, stubborn thing in him that wanted to walk back into that building one time, not as the man who left it broken, just as himself. So on Saturday evening, he put on a plain charcoal suit with no statement in it. And he drove across town alone, because his wife had a foundation board meeting running long and had told him she would meet him there. Now, before we go into that room, you need to know about the woman waiting inside it, and you need to know what happened between them. Because otherwise, the next 20 minutes will read as simple cruelty, and it was never simple. Sabrina Vaughn had married Emmett Cobb when they were both 23. She had been, in high school, the most ambitious person in a building full of kids who had been raised not to expect much, in a neighborhood where that expectation had been set for them long before they arrived. She wanted out of Brightbank the way some people want air, and Emmett, who wanted only to build things, loved that about her, loved the sheer forward pressure of her, and spent 11 years of marriage doing something he did not have a word for at the time but understood perfectly well by 44. He made himself into a platform for her to stand on, and then he was surprised that she looked past him. There was a night he still thought about, though less than he used to. She wanted a certification, a commercial real estate credential, an 8-week program with an enrollment fee of $2,100, which in the year in question was more money than the two of them had ever had at one time. She brought it up twice and then stopped bringing it up, which was worse. Emmett took his grandfather's framing tools, the ones with W.C. burned into the handles, to a pawn shop on Ostrander Street on a Tuesday morning and came out with $1,800 and made up the rest from a job he took on his one day off. He never told her where the money came from. He did not want gratitude. He wanted her to have the thing. The night the program ended, there was a networking reception downtown. And Emmett drove her and then waited outside because the reception was for participants only. And it started raining somewhere around the second hour. He had a thin jacket. He stood under an overhang that did not overhang much. By the time she came out, he had been standing in it for 90 minutes, and the rain had gotten into his collar and his shoes and the waistband of his pants. She looked at him standing there, soaked on the sidewalk, and her face did something complicated and quick, and what she said was, "Why do you always have to look so pathetic?" Emmett Cobb said nothing. He said nothing that night, and he said nothing most nights for another 6 years, and at the time he believed that this was patience. He understood it differently now. He understood that a man can pour himself into a cup somebody has already decided not to drink from, and that continuing to pour is not devotion. It is just a way of not looking at the cup. The marriage ended when he was 35. She left with 2 suitcases on a Sunday and a look on her face like she had already been gone for a year, which, as it turned out, she had. He did not chase her. He did not call her mother. He let her go and he went quiet. Hold on to the pawn shop. It comes back. The auditorium smelled like new carpet and old building, which is a specific combination anybody who has been inside a renovated school will recognize instantly. Somebody had strung cafe lights across the front of the stage. There was a folding table with wine, and a folding table with a sheet cake, and a slideshow running on a laptop, projecting yearbook photographs onto the back wall in a slow loop. Emmett came in at 7:40 and stood at the back for a minute, looking up. He was looking at the trusses. He could not help it. Anyone who works in structure does the same thing in every room they enter. The same way a dentist looks at your teeth while you talk. He looked at the new steel running the length of the ceiling and at the clean welds at the joints. And he thought. The way he had thought every time he saw the ellipses that $840,000 was a very small amount of money to keep a roof off of 400 children. Then he lowered his eyes and found the room. Sabrina Vaughn saw him within 90 seconds. He watched it happen, the small snap of recognition, and then the arrangement of her face into something prepared. She was 43, and she looked well. That is worth saying plainly, because the story does not need her to have fallen apart physically, and she had not. She worked at a title company. She had a condominium downtown with a view of the river. She had, standing beside her, a tall man in a suit that had cost a great deal and fit him about 80% correctly. And she had her hand looped through his arm, in a way that was less affection than presentation. "Well," Sabrina said, and her voice was pitched to travel. "Look who finally showed up." The cluster around her turned. 4 or 5 people. Dale Pruitt, who had been a linebacker and now sold insurance and had spent 25 years telling the same 3 stories. A woman named Corinne. 2 others Emmett did not immediately place. Emmett said, "Sabrina." 19 years, she said. 19 years and you still have that same look on your face. Like somebody just asked you a hard question. She smiled at her circle to make sure they were with her. "What do you do these days, Emmett? Still swinging a hammer?" "I am in construction," he said. "Construction," she repeated, as though the word itself were a punchline, and one of the men behind her laughed. Here is where the evening could have ended. He could have gotten a plastic cup of bad wine, spoken off to 4 people, and driven home, and the whole thing would have been an unremarkable Saturday. Instead, somebody, and Emmett never did find out who, asked whether he had ever remarried. "I did," Emmett said, 3 years ago. The circle went quiet for about 1 full second. Then Sabrina Vaughn laughed. It was a big laugh, an intentional one, a laugh built to persuade a room before it persuaded the person laughing. She turned all the way around to face the group, opening the moment up like a hand of cards. "Y'all hear that," she said. "Emmett Cobb is married. A man who could not hold a household together in 11 years suddenly has a wife nobody has ever met." 3 years, Emmett said. 3 years. And where is she tonight? "She had a meeting. She is coming." "A meeting," Sabrina said. "On a Saturday. She runs a foundation." "Oh," Sabrina said, and drew the word out, and the circle laughed. And something in her face relaxed into a confidence that would turn out to be the most expensive expression of her life. "A foundation. Of course she does. And she is coming any minute now." Dale Pruitt said, "Maybe she is stuck in traffic from the imaginary part of town." That got the biggest laugh of the night so far. Emmett Cobb stood there and did not answer, and the thing he was actually doing in that moment was not what anybody in the room would have guessed. He was not humiliated. He was not even particularly angry. He was standing in a room he had paid to make safe, being told he was nothing by people sitting under his steel. And the overwhelming feeling in his chest was something much closer to sadness than to rage. Anger is a bad tenant, his grandmother used to say. You let it stay long enough, it stops paying rent and starts tearing out the walls. He had learned that one the hard way, over about a decade. What he did notice, and what nobody else in that circle noticed at all, was the man standing beside Sabrina Vaughn. His name was Chandler Voss. Emmett would learn that within the next 4 minutes. What he registered first was not the suit, or the haircut, or the watch, though all 3 were doing a lot of work. What he registered was that Chandler Voss was not looking at his face. Chandler Voss was looking at the truck keys in Emmett's left hand. specifically at the fob. It was a plain black fob with a small enameled tag on the ring, dark green, with a white outline of a truss bridge on it. It was the kind of thing a company orders 400 of and hands out at a safety picnic. Nobody looks at it. Chandler Voss looked at it twice. Then he looked away, and then 30 seconds later he looked at it again, and the second look lasted a half beat too long. And Emmett Cobb, who had spent 20-years reading men across job site tables, understood immediately that he was watching somebody try to solve an arithmetic problem in his head, without letting anyone see him work. That is the detail. Hold on to the key fob. That is the one that takes the whole night apart. Because Chandler Voss recognized that logo. He had seen it 11 months earlier at the top of a pre-qualification list, and he had spent a considerable amount of energy since then making sure nobody ever connected his name to that list. And he was now standing 3 feet from a man he had been told, repeatedly and with great confidence, was a nobody. Sabrina noticed nothing. She was busy. And here is a small thing happened in the next 90 seconds that nobody in that circle registered. And that turned out to matter more than anything Sabrina Vaughan's said all night. A man named Russ Tidwell wandered over. Russ had been a year behind them and had come as somebody's guest, and he drove a concrete mixer for a ready mixes outfit that supplied about a third of the commercial pours on that side of the city. He was holding 2 plastic cups because he had gotten one for his wife and then lost track of her. He looked at Emmett and said, "Hey, I know you." Emmett said, "I don't think so." "Yeah, I do," Russ said. He pointed with a cup. "Not you." That he was pointing at the key fob. "I've been on your sites," Russ said. "Broadway Approach, 2 summers ago, and that thing out in Blue Springs." He grinned. "Y'all are the only outfit in this town that lets its mixer driver use the trailer bathroom. I have told about 400 people that." There was a small, strange pause. Sabrina Vaughn said, "His sights?" Russ Tidwell looked between the two of them and, being a person of ordinary social instincts, sensed that he had walked into something without being able to identify what. "Cobb Bridge," he said, slower. "Right?" He looked at Emmett. "You're Cobb." "Yeah," Emmett said. Sabrina laughed, and it was the second big laugh of the night, and it was slightly less certain than the first one. "Emmett," she said, "do you have a truck with a logo on it now? Is that what we are doing?" Emmett Cobb said nothing at all. He was aware, with the particular clarity you get in moments like that, of exactly 3 things. That Russ Tidwell had just handed him an opening the size of a garage door. That Sabrina Vaughn would have believed almost nothing he said in that moment anyway. And that Chandler Voss, standing 8 inches to her left, had gone completely still, not startled. Still, there is a difference, and Emmett had watched enough men across enough tables to know it. Russ Tidwell drifted off to find his wife, having accidentally lit a fuse he would not learn about for another 3 months. "Honestly," Sabrina said, recovering, and now she had an audience of about 9, "it is a little sad. Inventing a whole wife. Emmett, we are all adults. Nobody here is going to think less of you for being alone." "I am not alone," Emmett said. "You have been alone since the day I walked out of that house." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, quietly and without any particular edge, "You might want to slow down." "Excuse me?" "You are about to say something you cannot take back." It was not a threat. There was nothing in it at all, and that was what made it land strangely. Sabrina Vaughn's smile flickered. 1 frame out of 30, a thing so small that only 2 people in that auditorium caught it. One of them was Emmett Cobb. The other was a woman standing 11 feet away with her arms folded and her jaw set, who had been watching this entire exchange without touching her wine. Her name was Yolanda Merrick, and in about 20 minutes, she was going to end 3 people's evenings, and one of them was not going to recover. Yolanda Merrick had graduated from Fairlane High School with the rest of them, and had gone on to do a job that almost nobody at the reunion could have described accurately, if asked. She was a compliance auditor. Specifically, she did vendor verification and subcontractor certification review for public infrastructure contracts, which means that when a state or a city awards a large construction project, somebody has to confirm that the companies listed on the paperwork are real companies, doing real work, with real employees, at the prices stated. Yolanda Merrick was that somebody for about $140 million of public work a year. It is not exciting work. It involves a great deal of comparing one document to another document. But it is the reason that public money mostly ends up in public projects instead of somebody's boat. And the people who do it well develop a particular quality that Yolanda Merrick had possessed since roughly the ninth grade, which is that they do not let a wrong thing go by just because correcting would be socially awkward. In 10th grade, she had told Dale Pruitt that his science fair volcano was going to fail its own hypothesis, and she had been right, and he had never entirely forgiven her. She had been standing at the edge of that circle for 6 minutes. She had not said anything yet. She was waiting for one more piece of information, and it arrived at 7:58, when the double doors at the back of the auditorium opened. Adrienne Cobb had been to a great many rooms in her professional life, and had a way of entering them that had nothing to do with volume. She was 41. She was wearing a deep blue dress because the proceeding she had come from had run into the evening, and she had not had time to change into anything less. And she crossed the back of that auditorium the way a person crosses a room when it has never once occurred to them that they might need the room's permission to be in it. Somebody near the wine table said, out loud and without meaning to, "Wait, is that Adrienne Cobb? The Trades Fund one?" said the woman next to her. Adrienne walked the length of the aisle and put her hand on her husband's arm and kissed his cheek. "Sorry," she said. "That went long." Then she turned and looked at the group in front of them with an expression of perfectly genuine, perfectly unbothered friendliness, and said, "Hi, I am Adrienne." Sabrina Vaughan's face did something that 4 separate people described differently afterward, but that everyone agreed on the substance of. Emmett would think later that the cruelty had never actually been about him. It had been insurance. Sabrina Vaughn had spent 19 years carrying a specific fear, one she had probably never said out loud even alone in a car, which was that she had traded something real for something that only looked real, and that she had done it while she was still young enough for it to count as a decision rather than a mistake. Standing in a room full of people who had been at her wedding, she had needed witnesses. Not to convince them, to convince herself. Adrienne walking through those doors was not a surprise to her. It was the exact thing she had been out running, arriving in the one room she could not leave. Sabrina recovered, more or less. She said, "Oh, so you are Emmett's wife." "I am," Adrienne said pleasantly. "I had no idea he had." She stopped, restarted. "I had no idea he had someone like you." "Most people do not take the time to find out what someone has," Adrienne said. There was no malice in it whatsoever, which made it worse. Then she leaned in close to Emmett's ear, and what she said next was for him alone. "The contract came through this afternoon. All signatures. It is done." Emmett Cobb felt that land somewhere behind his sternum, quiet and settled, the way good news lands when you have stopped needing it to prove anything to anybody. He thought, standing there, about the first time he had met her. It had been at a workforce development event in a union hall 4 years earlier. The kind of evening with folding chairs and a sheet cake and a speaker who ran 12 minutes long. Adrienne had been there because her foundation was funding apprenticeship stipends. Emmett had been there because one of his ironworkers had a daughter in the program. They had not spoken during the event. What had happened was that afterward, when the room emptied out the way rooms do, Emmett Cobb had stayed behind and stacked 80 folding chairs onto a rolling rack with a 70-year-old custodian named Ray, because 80 chairs is a lot of chairs for one man at 9 at night. Adrienne had watched that from the doorway for about 4 minutes without either of them noticing. She told him later, much later, that she had a rule she had developed over 11 years of foundation work. And the rule was that she did not evaluate people by what they did while the room was watching. She said that in her line of work she met a lot of men who were generous in a way that required an audience, and that she had gotten very good at spotting the difference and very tired of having to. He had asked her on their third meeting what she had thought when she saw him stacking chairs. She said, "I thought most men leave once the cameras are off. And what did you think when you found out what I do for a living? I thought I would wait and see if it changed anything about you." she said. It took me about 2 years to be sure it had not. That was the thing that nobody in that auditorium understood about the two of them, and that Sabrina Vaughn in particular would never understand, because it did not fit any story she had available. They had not built what they had on a gesture. They had built it the way Emmett Cobb built everything, which was one ordinary, correct day at a time, with nobody watching, until eventually somebody was. Then she added, still quietly, Yolanda Merrick called me on my way here. She has something she needs to say tonight. I think you should let her say it. Emmett looked across at Yolanda Merrick, 11 feet away, arms folded. She was already looking back. Now, before Yolanda Merrick opened her mouth, there is something you have to understand about what she actually knew, because it was considerably more than a piece of gossip about a scholarship. And it had been eating at her for 4 months. 11 months earlier, a proposal had come across her desk for a pedestrian bridge. The Ostrander Street crossing is a 280-foot pedestrian and bicycle bridge over a rail cut in the Brightbank neighborhood. It exists because on the north side of that cut there are 400 houses, and on the south side there is Fairlane High School. And before the bridge was built, children walked a mile, and 4/10 around to the nearest signalized crossing, or they did not, and every few years one of them was hit. The bridge had been funded through a state program and built by a contractor called Meridian Structural, and the fabricated steel for the walking surface and the two main girders had been supplied by a subcontractor listed on the paperwork as Halbrook Metals of Independence, Missouri. Yolanda Merrick had been doing routine post-award verification in June when she pulled Halbrook Metals and found in about 40 minutes that it had no employees, no facility, no equipment, and no history prior to 14 months before the bid. It had an address that was a mailbox service and a website that had been built in one afternoon. Halbrook Metals had not fabricated anything. It was a pass-through. Somebody had set it up, listed it as a certified supplier to satisfy the program's participation requirements, taken the margin, and bought the actual steel somewhere much cheaper. It is worth taking 1 minute to explain why a mailbox company exists at all, because most people assume public construction fraud looks like a suitcase of cash. And it almost never does. When a government body funds a construction project, the money usually comes with participation requirements attached. A certain percentage of the work has to go to certified small businesses, or to disadvantaged business enterprises, or to firms based in the state. The rules vary. The intent is the same, which is that public money should not flow exclusively to the 4 largest contractors in the region forever. The requirement creates a problem for a contractor who does not want to actually use a small supplier, because small suppliers are less predictable and sometimes cost more. And the solution that dishonest people arrive at over and over in every state is to invent one. You register an entity. You get it certified, which requires a sponsoring letter from somebody with standing in the industry, attesting that this company can actually do the work. You list it on the bid as your certified supplier. Then you buy the material from wherever you were always going to buy it, run the invoice through the entity, add a margin, and pocket the difference. The paperwork is perfect. The percentage is satisfied. Nobody ever visits the address. That is what Halbrook Metals was. That by itself is fraud. It is a serious, prosecutable, career-ending kind of fraud, and it happens more often than anyone would like. But that was not the part that had kept Yolanda Merrick awake. The part that had kept her awake was that when she requested the mill certifications for the steel that had actually gone into the Ostrander Street Bridge, she got back a set of documents that did not match anything. Wrong heat numbers, wrong mill, a grade designation that did not correspond to the specification in the contract drawings. The girders holding up a bridge that 400 children walked across twice a day had been fabricated out of steel that nobody could prove was the steel it was supposed to be. She had filed. She had filed in June and again in August, and had been told each time that the matter was under review, that the bridge had passed its final inspection, that a documentation irregularity was not the same as a structural finding. and that she should be careful about the words she put in writing. Yolanda Merrick had spent 4 months watching kids walk across that bridge on her way to work. And 11 months earlier, when she had first pulled the file on Hal Brook Metals to see who had signed off on its certification application, the name on the sponsoring letter had been Chandler Voss. That was why she had been standing at the edge of a circle at a high school reunion for 6 minutes with her arms folded, not drinking her wine. Yolanda Merrick uncrossed her arms and walked into the middle of it. "Sabrina," she said, "that is enough." Sabrina Vaughn blinked at her. "Yolanda, this does not concern you." "It does, actually." Her voice was not raised. That was the thing that made people turn. It carried the way a voice carries when the person using it has decided in advance exactly how far it needs to go. "Because some of us have known for years what kind of man Emmett Cobb is," she said. "And we have all just stood here for 20 minutes and watched you build an entire evening on pretending otherwise. So I am going to fix that, and then I am going to say something else, and I would like everybody to hear both parts." The auditorium had gotten noticeably quieter. Not silent. The kind of quiet where people stop their own conversations to listen to somebody else's. 6 years ago, Yolanda said, this school's scholarship endowment was worth about $40,000 and paid out 2 awards a year of $500 each. Today it is worth $2.1 million and it pays full tuition and fees for 9 graduates a year. Every single one of those kids that you have all clapped for at the alumni dinner. Everyone. She let that sit for a second. It is him. It has been him since the beginning. He has never put his name on it. He has never come to a single award night. And the fund's paperwork lists a trust and an attorney and nothing else. I found out by accident going through disbursement records last spring, and I have not told a soul until right now. And I want everybody in here to understand what 9 full rides a year does to a school like ours, she said. Because it is not 9 kids. It is 9 families a year who do not have to decide which one of their children gets to go. The room made a sound, not a gasp, a kind of collective shift. Somebody in the back said, "Wait, that has been Emmett?" Emmett Cobb stood there and felt something in his chest tighten and loosen at the same time. He had written the first check 19 years after leaving that building, alone at a kitchen table past midnight, and had told himself that it did not need a name on it in order to work. He had believed that. He still believed it. What he had not expected was how strange it would feel to hear it said out loud, like a door he had kept locked out of pure habit had swung open without anybody asking him. He did not say anything. He never had. "And the roof," Yolanda said. Emmett turned his head sharply. Yolanda Merrick looked up at the ceiling and then back at the room. 4 years ago, this auditorium was condemned. Bad trusses. $840,000. And the district did not have it, and we all held our reunions at the VFW hall. She gestured upward with 2 fingers. Anonymous donor. No plaque. There is no plaque because the donor made no plaque a condition of the money. She looked at Sabrina Vaughn. "You have been standing in this room for 2 hours, telling people he never built anything," she said. "You are standing under it." 43 people looked up at the ceiling at the same time. It is a strange thing to watch a room physically reorient around a fact. Emmett Cobb had never wanted that and had spent 2 years making sure it could not happen. And it had happened anyway in about 11 seconds, and there was nothing to be done about it now. Sabrina Vaughn had gone very pale. Her mouth was slightly open. She had, for the first time that evening, absolutely nothing prepared. But Yolanda Merrick was not finished, and the scholarship had never been the reason she came. She turned deliberately 90 degrees and faced Chandler Voss. "And you," she said, "might want to sit the next part out quietly." Chandler Voss had spent the last 2 minutes doing an extremely good impression of a man politely uninvolved in somebody else's family business. He had a plastic cup of wine in one hand and a mild, pleasant expression on his face. And he did not change it now, which Emmett noticed and filed away, because a man who does not change expression when a compliance auditor turns to face him is a print who has practiced. "I am sorry," Chandler said. "Do we know each other?" "No," Yolanda said, "but I have read a great deal of your handwriting." She said it without any drama at all, which is the only way that sentence lands. 11 months ago, you sponsored a certification application for a supplier called Halbrook Metals out of Independence. You signed the letter attesting to their fabrication capacity. Halbrook Metals has no employees, no shop, no equipment, and no history before last year. It is a mailbox, Chandler Voss said. Evenly, I consult for a lot of companies. I am not responsible for how every one of them is structured. You are responsible for what you attest to in writing, on a public contract, Yolanda said. But that is not why I am talking to you at a high school reunion instead of in a deposition. She took one step closer. I am talking to you here because Halsbrook was listed as the steel supplier on the Ostrander Street pedestrian bridge, and the mill certifications for the girders on that bridge do not match anything. Wrong heat numbers, wrong grade. There is no traceable documentation of what steel is actually holding up that structure. Something moved through the crowd. Half the people in that auditorium had gone to Fairlane. A significant number of them had children who currently went to Fairlane. A woman near the cake table said, out loud, "My son walks across that bridge." That, Yolanda said, is exactly why I've filed 3 times since June and been told each time it is a documentation irregularity. Chandler Voss set his wine cup down on the corner of the folding table, and when he spoke his voice had not changed at all. And that fact was, to the 4 people in the room who understood what they were watching, the most damning thing that happened all evening. This is a serious accusation to make in a room full of people who have been drinking, he said. If you have a professional concern, there are professional channels. I would encourage you to use them. And I would encourage you to think very carefully about the difference between a filing and a public statement. Because one of those is protected, and the other is not. I know exactly which one this is, Yolanda said. Then I assume you have counsel. I do, actually. And then Emmett Cobb said the first thing he had said in 4 minutes. Yolanda, he said, what time did you file the third one? She looked at him. August 11th. And you copied the district engineer. I copied everybody. Emmett Cobb took his phone out of his jacket pocket. He did not do it dramatically. He did it the way a man checks a phone. He looked at the screen for about 4 seconds. And then he turned it around so that Yolanda Merrick could see it. And then, after a moment, so that the group could. It was an email. It had come in at 6:12 that evening, while he was driving across town in a plain charcoal suit to a reunion he had not wanted to attend. The subject line read, Ostrander St. Ped Bridge, emergency closure, effective immediately. Emmett Cobb had spent 4 months quietly paying for an independent inspection out of his own company's pocket because a compliance auditor he had never spoken to had filed 3 reports about a bridge in his old neighborhood, and nobody had done anything about them. They found a fatigue crack in the north girder, he said. 11 inches. They closed it at 4 this afternoon. The auditorium was, at that moment, completely silent. There is a thing about steel that almost nobody outside the trade knows. And it is the reason a room full of people who had no engineering background at all understood in about 4 seconds that something very bad had been avoided. Steel does not usually fail by being overloaded. That is the cartoon version, where something too heavy goes on top and the beam snaps. Real structures almost never fail that way, because engineers design for overload with a margin that is genuinely enormous. Steel fails from fatigue. It fails because a load goes on and comes off, and goes on and comes off, a few million times. And every one of those cycles works a microscopic flaw a little wider. A hairline that nobody could see in year 1 becomes visible in year 9. And the specific dangerous thing about a fatigue crack is that it does not grow at a constant speed. It grows slowly for a very long time, and then it grows fast, because the longer the crack gets, the more the remaining steel has to carry. And the more it has to carry, the faster the crack runs. An 11-inch fatigue crack in a 280-foot pedestrian girder is not a maintenance item. It is not next year's budget line. It is a bridge that somebody is going to have to close today. And the reason it happened in 9 years instead of 80 is that the steel in that girder was not the steel the drawings called for, and nobody had ever been able to prove what it actually was. Every parent in that auditorium did that math without being walked through it. And this is the part of the evening that Sabrina Vaughn never fully recovered from, and it had nothing to do with money at all. She turned to Chandler Voss and said, in a voice that had lost every bit of its performance, "Children walk on that." Chandler Voss said, "Do not do this here. Children walk on that, Chandler." And Chandler Voss looked at the woman whose arm had been through his for the entire evening, and said flatly, in front of 43 people, "Do not put that on me." There is a moment in a certain kind of collapse where the person going down looks around for the people who were laughing with them 20 minutes earlier, and finds that the room has quietly changed shape. Sabrina Vaughn looked around for her circle. Dale Pruitt had become extremely interested in the wine table. Corinne was looking at her phone with the specific intensity of a person who has no notification. Two others had drifted 8 feet toward the door, in a way that was not quite leaving but was no longer standing with her. Nobody was laughing. "I lied for you," she said to Chandler Voss. Her voice had gotten loud in a way she was no longer controlling. 2 years ago, when the auditors called my office about that account, I told them I did not know anything. I told my own mother that condo was clean. "That sounds like a conversation for another time," Chandler said. "I told every person in this room tonight that you were the better choice." Chandler Voss straightened his jacket. Then he said the sentence that Emmett Cobb would think about, on and off, for a long time afterward, because it was said without any heat at all, which is the only way a thing like that gets said by a man who means it. "You told them that," he said, "because you needed to hear it. Not because I asked." And he walked out of the auditorium. He did not run. He did not slam anything. He walked at a completely normal speed, down the aisle and through the doors, and about 9 seconds after he was gone, somebody near the back said quietly, "Well?" Sabrina Vaughn stood alone in the middle of a room with 43 people in it. Now, here is where the story does not do the thing you are expecting, and it is important, because the thing you are expecting is not what happened. Emmett Cobb did not deliver a speech. He had imagined delivering one. He had imagined it many times over 19 years, in trucks and in hotel rooms, and at 2 in the morning at kitchen tables, three different houses. He had a version of it that was cutting, and a version that was cold, and a version that was long. Standing in that auditorium with his wife's hand in his and his ex-wife 11 feet away, with her whole evening in pieces around her heels, he discovered that he did not want to say any of them. There is a kind of justice that shouts. There is another kind that just stands still and lets the truth do the work. He had spent 19 years learning which one he was built for. What he actually said after a while was this. "Sabrina." She looked up. "The bridge is going to be closed about 8 months, he said. Those kids are going to walk the long way around Vernon Avenue in the dark in January. That is the part of tonight that is actually bad. Everything else that happened in this room is just Saturday." He put his cup down on the folding table. "I hope you land somewhere good," he said, and he meant it. And that was somehow worse for her than anything else that had been said all night. What happened over the following 20 minutes was, to Emmett Cobb, the strangest part of the entire night. And it was not triumphant. It was awkward. People came over. That was the thing he had not prepared for at all. He had prepared, over 19 years, for hostility and for indifference. He had never once prepared for 43 people who suddenly did not know how to talk to him. A woman named Patrice, who had been in his homeroom and whose son had received one of the 9 full scholarships 2 years earlier, walked up and stood in front of him and could not get a sentence out. She tried twice. On the third try, she said, "Marcus is at Missouri State. He is in his 2nd year. He is studying civil." Emmett said, "I know. He is doing well. You know, they send me the grades," he said. "Not the names. The grades and the majors and whether they came back for a 2nd year. That is all I ask for." Patrice put her hand over her mouth and turned away for a second, and then turned back and said, "I am not going to make a scene." And then made a small one, and Emmett stood there and let her, because there was nothing else to do. Dale Pruitt came over, which took a certain amount of nerve, and said, "Hey man, look. Earlier, the thing I said." "It is fine, it is not," Dale said. He looked at his shoes. "My daughter walks that bridge. I know." Yeah, Dale said. Okay. He put out his hand and Emmett shook it, and Dale went back to the wine table. The last one was the one that stayed with him. A man named Gerald Odom, who Emmett could barely remember, came over and did not say anything about the scholarship or the roof or the bridge at all. He said, "You know they used to call you the ghost. Who did?" "All of us," Gerald said cheerfully, with no idea he was saying anything at all. "After the divorce. You just stopped coming to stuff." Somebody would say, "Hey, what happened to Emmett Cobb?" And somebody else would say, "Man, that dude's a ghost." Then he laughed and clapped Emmett on the shoulder and went to get cake. Emmett Cobb stood there for a while afterward, with a plastic cup in his hand. He had spent 19 years believing that going quiet was the honorable thing to do, that a man who has been humiliated does not explain. He simply gets to work, and the work speaks for him eventually. He had built a company on that. He had put $2.1 million into an endowment on it, and $840,000 into a roof. And it had never occurred to him, not once in 19 years, that a whole neighborhood full of people had spent that same period believing he had disappeared because he had failed. He had not been protecting his dignity. He had been letting other people write his story in exchange for not having to say anything. And he had told himself for 2 decades that this was strength. His grandmother had a line about that too, and he had never once applied it to himself until that moment, standing under a roof nobody knew he had paid for. A closed mouth does not get fed, baby. It just gets quiet. Then a voice from the third row said, "Emmett Cobb, come here a minute." Odell Fairbanks was 73 years old and had taught woodshop and drafting at Fair Lane High School for 31 years, and had been invited to every single class reunion since he retired, and had come to all of them because he had never had children of his own, and had decided a long time ago that this was the version he got. He had taught in that shop through 3 superintendents and 2 rounds of budget cuts that tried to close the program. And both times he had gone downtown himself and sat in a folding chair for 4 hours, waiting to speak for 3 minutes. His argument had never changed. He told them that a boy from Brightbank who could read a framing square at 17 had something nobody could take from him, and that if they closed the shop they should be honest about what they were telling those kids they were for. The shop stayed open both times. Emmett Cobb had learned to cut a rafter in it. He had been sitting in the third row for the last 40 minutes, in a cardigan, with a cane hooked over the seat back in front of him, not saying a word. Emmett went over. "Sit down," Odell said. "You are too tall to talk to standing up. Never fixed that." Emmett sat. "I want to ask you something," Odell said, "and I want you to tell me the truth, because I have been sitting here doing arithmetic for about 6 years, and I would like to know if I did it right." He turned his head. "Was it you that fixed my auditorium?" Emmett said, "Mr. Fairbanks, that is not an answer." "Yes, sir." Odell Fairbanks nodded slowly, 3 or 4 times, looking at the stage. "I taught in this building 31 years, he said. "I watched them chain those doors in 2021. I came to the reunion at the VFW Hall 2 years in a row and sat next to a slot machine and drank a beer with a bunch of 50-year-olds who all told me the same thing, which is that nothing in this neighborhood ever gets fixed." He tapped his cane once against the floor, and then it got fixed. He turned and looked at Emmett directly. "Come by the house tomorrow," he said. "Not tonight, tomorrow, around 10. I have got something of yours. I do not think you do, sir." "I know I do," Odell Fairbanks said. 10 o'clock. Emmett Cobb drove home that night with his wife beside him and the radio off, north through Brightbank, and then east, past the storefronts and the rail cut, and the dark shape of the closed bridge with its new orange barricades already up at both ends. Neither of them said much for a while. Then Adrian said, "You did not tell me about the auditorium." "No. 2 years. It did not seem like a thing to say." She was quiet for a block. "Emmett," she said, "I have run a foundation for 11 years. Do you know how many people I have met who do a good thing quietly? A lot. Do you know how many of them do a good thing quietly and then also do not tell their wife? She let it sit. That is not humility anymore. At some point, that is just a habit of not being known." He drove for a while. "I know," he said. "Do you?" "I have been working on it," he said. "I am slower at it than I am at most things." She reached over and put her hand on his arm and left it there, and they went the rest of the way like that. At 10 the next morning, Emmett Cobb parked in front of a small brick house on a street in Brightbank with a chain-link fence and a concrete porch. And Odell Fairbanks let him in and told him to go down to the basement and stop asking questions. The basement smelled like sawdust and old newspaper. There was a workbench along the back wall that Odell had built himself in 1979. On it was a canvas roll. Emmett Cobb had not seen that canvas roll in 21 years. He untied it, and the tools were inside, all of them, the framing hammer and the 4 chisels, and the block plane and the folding rule, and every one of them had been cleaned and oiled, and the wooden handles were dark with age and use, and burned into each one in letters a man had made with a hot nail sometime around 1955, were the initials W. C. He did not say anything for a while. Then he said, "How?" "Ostrander Street Pawn Shop," Odell said from the stairs. 1999, I think. Might have been 2000. I used to walk past that window every day on my way from the bus. He came down 2 more steps. "I taught you in that shop for 3 years, Emmett. You think I would not recognize your grandfather's chisels sitting in a pawn shop window on the street where you lived?" Emmett Cobb put his hand flat on the workbench. "Why did you never say anything?" "Because you were 25, Odell said, "and you were married to that girl. And you had sold your grandpa's tools for something, and I figured whatever it was you would want it to be your business." He shrugged. "So I bought them, and I put them in my basement, and I figured you would come and get them when you were ready. That was 21 years ago. I know how long it was." Odell Fairbanks came the rest of the way down the stairs and looked at the tools on the bench. "I am 73, he said. "I have had 2 heart procedures. My sister keeps sending me brochures for a place in Lee's Summit. I was starting to think I was going to have to leave a note about it, and a note is a coward's way to give a man something." Emmett Cobb, who was 44 years old and had signed a $387 million contract 2 days earlier, stood in a basement in Brightbank and could not speak. He carried the canvas roll up the stairs himself. He would not let Odell touch it now. It would be very satisfying to tell you that everything after that went the way it should have. Some of it did. The Ostrander Street Bridge investigation moved from a documentation irregularity to a federal matter in about 6 weeks, and it moved because Chandler Voss did the thing that men like Chandler Voss reliably do, which is that he fought. He did not confess. He never confessed, not at any point, not once. And it is worth saying that plainly, because we are all trained by stories to expect a moment of breaking, and it does not come. And for about 5 weeks, he was winning. This is the part of the story that nearly ended it. And it is worth slowing down for, because it is closer to how these things actually go than the version where the truth simply comes out. The contractor of record on the Ostrander Street Bridge, Meridian Structural, had gone through a restructuring 18 months earlier. Its project files from the relevant period had been migrated to a new document system. And in that migration, a significant portion of the supplier correspondence had been lost, not destroyed. Lost in the boring way that things get lost when a company changes software, and a person who knew where everything was takes a job in Tulsa, which meant that the paper trail connecting Chandler Voss to Halbrook Metals ran through exactly one document, the sponsoring letter. And Chandler Voss's position, delivered through counsel in a very reasonable tone, was that he had signed a routine attestation on the basis of information provided to him by a client, that he had been deceived like everybody else, and that he was in fact a victim of Halbrook Metals rather than its architect. It was a good position. It was, on the available evidence, close to unfalsifiable. In November, a regional office recommended closing the referral for insufficient evidence of intent. Emmett Cobb read that recommendation in his truck in a gravel lot, outside a job site in Sedalia, and understood, with total clarity, that a man was about to walk away from a bridge with a crack in it, because a software migration had eaten some emails. He should have stopped there. That is what Yolanda Merrick said about Chandler Voss afterward. And she said it without any satisfaction at all, The way you would observe that a man standing in a road had been given every opportunity to step out of it. If Chandler Voss had said nothing further, if he had let the recommendation go through and gone quiet for 2 years, it is entirely possible that none of it would ever have come apart. But a man who has spent his life managing perception cannot leave a thing merely unproven. He needs it disproven. So in December, unprompted, through counsel, he produced a set of documents purporting to show that Halbrook Metals had been a legitimate operating entity, and that any deficiency in the mill certifications was the fault of a downstream broker. He did not have to do that. Nobody had asked him for it. The recommendation to close was already on a desk. The documents were forged, not well, were forged by somebody in a hurry who did not know that steel mill certification archives are retained and independently verifiable for a decade. And the moment those forgeries entered a federal proceeding, the case stopped being about a mailbox company and became about obstruction, which carries considerably more weight than fraud and requires considerably less interpretation. That is the thing about a cover-up. A fraud that is 4 years old can sometimes be argued into a fog. A forgery submitted last Tuesday is clean, dated, and extremely easy to prove. The investigators then did what investigators do once they have a thread, which is that they pulled it. And Halbrook Metals turned out not to be a single bad decision but a pattern. 6 certification sponsorships across 4 years, 3 states, and a total of roughly $31 million in public contracts on which a real certified small supplier had been listed and a mailbox had been paid. Chandler Voss was indicted in March. And here is the part that Emmett Cobb had not expected and did not enjoy. When the investigators reconstructed the timeline, they found that Chandler Voss had met Sabrina Vaughn 11 weeks after Cobb Bridge and Structure was added to the state's pre-qualified bidder list for the river crossing project. He had not found her at a bar. He had found her on a professional networking site where her employment history was public and where her marriage to Emmett Cobb had been listed in a college alumni profile for 15 years. He had wanted to know how a mid-sized heavy civil contractor structured its bids. He had wanted to know its bonding capacity and its margins and which suppliers it favored. And he had wanted somebody who had been married to the owner for 11 years and who was angry enough to talk. Sabrina Vaughn had not been a choice. She had been a root. Nobody told her. Emmett found out in a proffer summary his attorney forwarded him, and he sat with it for 2 days. And then he did something that he could not entirely explain then and cannot entirely explain now. He printed the relevant page, put it in an envelope with no note in it, and mailed it to her. He did not call. He did not want to talk to her, and he did not want her gratitude, and he did not want to watch her read it. He just did not think a person should find that out from a courtroom. What happened to Sabrina Vaughn is the part of this story that has no satisfaction in it whatsoever. She was not charged. She had not known about the steal. That was established fairly early, and it was true. But she had signed a statement 2 years earlier, saying she had no knowledge of an account she did, in fact, have knowledge of. And that statement was now a federal file, and the title company she worked for did not wait for a determination. They put her on leave in April, and she resigned in June. She was 43 years old with a resume that could not be explained in an interview. She sold the condominium with the view of the river. She moved to a 2-bedroom apartment near her mother in Raytown. She wrote to Emmett Cobb twice. The first letter was 4 pages long, and he read all of it. The second was 1 page, and he read that too. He never answered either one, and he thought about it a great deal. And he came to the conclusion, eventually, that there was no answer that would not have been either a lie or a cruelty, and that a man is allowed to decline both. She is not doing well. That is the honest ending of that thread. She is not homeless, and she is not destroyed, and she is also not going to get her 40s back. And there is no version of this story where somebody arrives with a check and fixes it. The Ostrander Street Bridge was closed for 11 months, not 8. For 11 months, 400 children in Brightbank walked 1 mile and 4/10 around to Vernon Avenue. In the dark in January, past a rail cut and 2 blind corners. There were 2 incidents. Neither one was fatal, and one of them involved a 14-year-old girl and a turning box truck. And Emmett Cobb has a copy of that police report in his desk and has never once been able to explain to anybody, including his wife, why he keeps it. Cobb Bridge and Structure rebuilt the girders at cost, not free. Emmett was very specific about that with his own board, because free would have been a gesture and at cost was a decision, and he wanted the difference on the record. Yolanda Merrick was not thanked by her employer. She was, in fact, quietly moved off public infrastructure work in the reorganization that followed, into a commercial portfolio, which is less money and less interesting. She has a framed thing on her wall from a federal agency that she says she does not care about. She is looking for another job. She has been for a year. She told Emmett once, over coffee, that if she had it to do again, she would file the first report sooner and the second one louder, and that the 4 months between June and October are the 4 months she thinks about. Odell Fairbanks moved into the place in Lee's Summit in the spring, which he had said he would never do. He is all right. Emmett visits on Sundays, most Sundays, and they do not talk about the auditorium. There is no plaque on it. There is still no plaque on it. Emmett Cobb was asked again, after everything came out, whether he would allow one, and he said no. And when the district superintendent pushed him on it, he said the only sentence on the subject he has ever said out loud to anybody. If there is a name on it, then it was a favor, he said. If there is no name on it, then it is just the roof. 19 months after that reunion, on a Tuesday in May, Emmett Cobb drove out to a job site on the river crossing, where his crews were setting the first of the replacement girders on the north approach. He was not needed there. He owns the company. There were 4 people on that site whose entire job is to not need him. He went anyway, because he goes. And he stood at the edge of the staging area in a hard hat, with his hands in his pockets, while a crane operator he had known for 12 years set 210,000 pounds of steel down onto a bearing pad with about a 1/4 inch of daylight to work with, and got it right the first time. Nobody clapped. Nobody ever claps for that. 4 men made small adjustments, and then somebody yelled something about lunch. In Emmett Cobb's left front pocket, where it has been every day for 21 years, there was a pawn shop ticket from a store on Ostrander Street, dated on a Tuesday morning, in the amount of $1,800 for 1 canvas roll of hand tools. I keep coming back to the ticket. Not the reunion, not the bridge, not the federal case. The pawn shop ticket Emmett Cobb has carried in his front pocket for 21 years, folded down small and gone soft at the creases, the way paper goes when you carry it that long. He got the tools back. Odell Fairbanks had them the whole time, cleaned and oiled in a basement in Brightbank. The ticket has been worthless since the morning it was written. He carries it anyway, and I keep thinking about why. Willis Cobb burned his initials into those handles because the world kept forgetting whose hands had done the work. His grandson pawned them for a woman who never knew, and then kept the ticket for 21 years. I do not think that is bitterness. I think it is the same instinct as the initials, a quiet refusal to let the record go missing. While this story is fictional, the lessons about what happens when the people who quietly hold a community together are the last ones anybody thinks to look at are very real. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the Don't link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.